So what I've called this presentation Conversation Design the Salesforce Way. And that's, essentially what I'm trying to say here is that this is sort of how we approach conversation design at Salesforce. And my hope here is that for those of you who are working on conversational AI products and are trying to sort of either establish a conversation design practice or grow your conversation design practice, whether you're in a major enterprise or even in a smaller institution, that some of what we've learned along the way in growing the practice at Salesforce will be of benefit to you in your work. So we know that conversation is it's easy to mess up as an experience. Everyone who worked on the experiences that we see here went in with the best intentions. That you don't, as a person who is creating a conversational product, go in intentionally trying to frustrate, alienate, mislead, or overwhelm a user. But it's also very easy to do. There are essentially these sort of norms or baseline practices of conversation that oftentimes we're not necessarily taught about in school. Growing up and being sort of socialized into our communities, we're kind of taught what's the quote unquote right and wrong way to talk. Some people are told, you shouldn't use words like, oh, well, like, but, when you're talking to people, because they're filler words and they don't really do anything. Well, spoiler alert, they do. And it's really important to consider that the way that we talk as ourselves who are building the product is not necessarily how everyone who uses the product that we build that's not how they talk. They don't necessarily talk in the same way, and that's okay. And so really, this is where conversation design can lead. We can use conversation design as a practice by which we can standardize the language that the conversational interface uses with the user. So that way, across a whole suite of products, sound like they're talking and coming from the same family, if you will, of conversationalists. There's a standard language pattern, tone of voice, interactional pattern, so that way your users don't necessarily get confused if they're switching from one chatbot or one conversational app within your suite of solutions. You wouldn't want, say, one product to greet your user with hello and another product to greet your user with howdy, and all of a sudden it doesn't feel like they come from the same brand, let alone maybe you have to use different words or different trigger mechanisms to get the bot to react in a way that is according to your, as the user's intent. Being able to define when to use conversation versus when not to. So I love this picture because it shows like you don't really need to send a book worth of text over a text message. All of this, I think, really encapsulates the idea that conversation is really good for certain interactional goals and maybe less effective for other interactional goals, and that's okay. And so really being able to guide an institution in terms of how they think through holistically supporting their customers, as well as driving an ethically diverse mindset in conversationalizing your platform. So again, like you can't just sort of take your help article, for example, copy and paste it into a message and turn it into a chatbot. But also thinking through, like, how are we representing different language varieties? Different, let's say, if we're thinking about English, world Englishes. The way that English is spoken or written in, say, the Bay Area of California is very different than how English is spoken and written, say, in Hyderabad, India. And it's very important because if our customers are based in Hyderabad, then we need to make sure that we're meeting our users where they are and in an authentic way, in a way that is not appropriative, whereby users who speak that variant of English are included in the product development lifecycle. And that's really where the power of the conversation design lies. But first things first, what is conversation design? Oftentimes, as we're trying to grow a conversation design practice at a company or at any kind of institution, this is one of the first questions that I get asked. And in order to answer this question, we need to set a baseline of what is conversation. And so my academic background is in linguistics. So this is the way that I conceptualize conversation based on the research from that field. Conversation is fundamentally an exchange of language. So there has to be language involved in order for it to be a conversation between two or more participants taking turns, meaning that if only one person is talking or chatting, it's not a conversation. So like right now, what I'm doing, not a conversation because I have taken up my whole screen. I can't see any of you. So if you're chatting me, there's no way I can know. There's no turn taking anywhere there. Rather, if I were, say, having a conversation with Rebecca, I saw you're in the audience. If we were having a conversation, then I'd be able to hear you. You would say things back to me or type things back to me. That's the turn-taking piece of conversation that is so fundamental to conversation as an interaction pattern. As these two or more participants take turns exchanging language, they do so towards some kind of goal. So every time we say something in conversation, we're doing something. There's an action there. We're not just talking about stuff. And usually the goals are something like transactional, social, or having to do with the relationship. So let's say if we're talking about coffee could be buying a cup of coffee, and I'm talking to the barista in order to complete the transaction. Or maybe I'm talking to Rebecca about our favorite coffee. I don't drink coffee, spoiler alert. So I should have probably picked a different example, but let's say I did drink coffee and we really loved a certain kind of coffee. Then maybe we talk about coffee, this particular brand of coffee in a certain way and create this social group of, well, we're all part of this group inherently because we talk about this coffee in a certain way. Or a relationship goal where like maybe I'm offering coffee by saying, hey, would you like a cup of coffee? And showing that we're, kind of close or getting to know each other. All of these things are things that we do with conversation, where then conversation design is essentially the practice of designing that outcome, that final interaction. And in order to do that, we have to think through what are the flows of interaction in order to get us from the beginning, which is the opening, the welcome, all the way to the end of this is the completion of whatever goal it is that we're trying to complete. And then once we get an idea of what we have to do in order to get the user there on the platform, what are the forms of language that we need to use in order to facilitate that interaction? What exactly are we going to say as a bot? And how are we going to say it? Because that's going to be really representative of who our company and organization is as a brand. And then eventually, what does that end up looking like in an interface? If you're in a voice interface and there's no chat support, then you're going to have a very different realization than you would in the user interface than you would if it were chat. One of the other big distinctions that we have to make is the difference between conversational UI and conversation design. So conversational UI, and sometimes this is referred to as conversational UX, essentially has to do with the graphical components of the conversation. And so the reason why I've included this GIF here is because there's actually no language here aside from the name of the chatbot. This emphasizes the fact that everything from, the messaging tray, the composer, every image that you send gets hosted somewhere graphically in the conversation. And that's really important in order to establish things like order and how to sort of follow the flow of the conversation. Then we also have to apply the same level of rigor we would to the visual piece of it to the language piece of it. So who's taking the first turn, the chatbot or the user? Because that's going to very strongly determine how you phrase what it is you're going to say to the user in the beginning. What does the pausing and pacing structure look like? How long does the bot wait before responding? Because if that pause before the bot responds is 0 seconds, after the bot has just said, hold on a minute, that seems super weird. I didn't have to wait that long. It comes across as unnatural. Conversation naturally has this pace, and that can vary from voice to text. So we need to think, okay, given the interaction mechanism that we're having conversation, and given the medium that we're deploying to, what's the pause length that we want to optimize for? Discourse markers, so those words that I talked about earlier, like oh, but, so, well, like, all of those tiny little fragments that we were maybe taught to throw out of how we talk because they're considered filler, actually are super important. They show how pieces of information in the conversation flow and relate to one another. They provide order. And so if I had a nickel for every time I was told one of my conversation designs sounds very natural, I just kind of chuckle. I'm like, really, it's discourse markers, because it shows, again, that natural transition between pieces of conversation. So what discourse markers are we going to use? Which ones will we not use? What kind of conversational style or system persona does the bot have? And how does that get expressed vocally? So like we can think about the pitch or the intonation, or textually. So maybe that's emojis, or maybe you decide that your bot does not put a period at the end of its utterance, or maybe it does. That has a big impact on how the user interprets essentially the tone of what the bot is saying. It's also important to consider other research firms and what the industry is saying about conversation design. So at Salesforce, a lot of my key stakeholders very much care about research institutions like Gartner and what they're saying about the technology and the industry as a whole. And so it helps to be able to reference points like this, saying, actually, it's not just me. There are others out there who very prominently recognize that conversation design is a key strategic investment for our business. Where organizations get lost in this process, a lot of times there's no distinction between conversational UI and conversation design, to the detriment of both practices. So there's the conflation of the graphical and the linguistic piece, whereby there's then no sort of real structure or intentionality behind either. So we need to make it very clear, like, yes, they're different, but not separate. They're related. And yet we still need to provide a great degree of rigor to both. There's a lack of linguistic diversity on staff in a lot of organizations. So for example, we want to make sure that a user, say, who is a Black woman in the southern states of the United States of America, doesn't have to change the way that she speaks or the way that she types in order to be able to get the conversational agent or assistant to respond in the way that she wants it to. It's important then to not just figure out how to represent that in the product, but also to make sure that on staff, we have someone who can speak to that in an authentic way. And so really, it's rather than trying to sort of forecast based on what we assume about that particular social identity, let's get that person on our staff. What is that person's perspective on how we go about crafting the experience so that way those individuals are represented and accounted for in the experience. Some organizations are too theoretical. So don't get me wrong, I love linguistics, but there are some folks out there who might anchor a little bit more on the linguistic side than on the application side. And oftentimes that's where a lot of teams might get lost or business stakeholders may sort of tune out, if you will. The flip side of that is then there are other teams who have absolutely no rigor. And again, they're like, well, I have conversations and I do so successfully, so I must know how to have conversations the right way. And then it results in this sort of exclusionary experience for anyone who has a conversation in a style, variant, or dialect that is different than the person who's building it. The way that we do it at Salesforce is, for now, we have centralized the team. So we have our different products across the Salesforce ecosystem, and conversation design sits at the center to sort of work and branch out to the different clouds across Salesforce in order to create a unified experience. And this helps drive consistency at the outset of our practice, maintain that ethos of equity and linguistic representation. So when teams move quickly, oftentimes this piece is the part that is the first one to be abandoned. And at Salesforce, it's really the beating heart of conversation design. We need to make sure that linguistic representation is a key tenet of what we do across our products. Standardizing quality control, so making sure we're all sort of, setting the bar at the same level for everybody. And acting as this force multiplier for teams who are maybe starting to ramp up and get to their goals quicker through working with us. We tell teams to engage us early and tell them that our product, our life cycle, if you will, is not that different than what you would say expect for the product development life cycle or even the UX life cycle, but that the actual sort of assets that we produce, if you will, are going to look a little different than what they expect. And here's how we produce it. Here's how they map to the process that that you, as a product manager stakeholder or a UX design stakeholder, are used to. This is what you should expect out of our team. Another way that we also help to grow conversation design as a force multiplier at Salesforce is by essentially sharing these sort of 5 must-knows of conversation design. These are sort of the most frequently referenced tenets of conversation design that I use when I'm trying to show any kind of team who is new to conversation design Salesforce. These are the basic things you should be thinking about in order to get off the ground. And really why this is important is because we want to make conversation design a mindset rather than, this sort of discrete practice. So that way, yes, we have our conversation design experts, our conversation designers, but that when we go to a PM, for example, they have this conversational mindset that we can snap to quickly and essentially move forward with really fast. The first of these is start with turn taking. So like I said, conversation is fundamentally about turn taking as a structure. If there's no turn taking involved, then it's not a conversation. sometimes turn taking maybe isn't necessarily the best method for accomplishing a given task. So let's say you have to collect information from a user and you need maybe 5 or 6 pieces of information. Well, depending on how you ask it, that could come out to be about 5 or 6 turns of 5 or 6 questions you need to ask the user, which results in 10 or 12 turn-taking sequences in order to accomplish the task of just collecting those pieces of information. In that case, if you have a graphical interface, it might be better to just use a form, because now you don't have to take 12 turns in order to get the information into the bot. So let's keep the best parts of graphical UX, if graphical UX is at your disposal for the experience you're creating, and pair it with the best parts of conversation as an interaction mechanism. Check your language bias. So again, we all have bias about how language, quote unquote, should be used, and we are socialized with this idea of how, or ideology about conversation. But we're not trying to make a dictionary here, and we're not here to judge how people communicate. It's about making sure that we essentially welcome the greatest group of people, the largest group of people, to our product. And if we're thinking about it from a business perspective, by opening up these different language varieties and having this open mind about how they communicate, we're addressing essentially untapped parts of our total addressable market. Pick a conversational style. So everything we say in conversation has to be said in some kind of way. And thinking through what the system persona is going to be for your conversational experience and how it gets realized in language. Does it ask a lot of questions? Does it pause in a longer or shorter format? Does it, use uptalk if we're talking about voice? Uptalk being saying a statement with a rising intonation at the end to make it sound like a question, like, I went to the store today. Things like that, to make it because there's actual linguistic value to how those things get encoded in language. Pick the characteristics of your voice and tone and then stay consistent, because if you deviate from it in some way, whatever that baseline is, it's going to send some kind of signal to the user that something is changing in regards to the relationship or the interaction at hand. Be action driven. So particularly if we're building some kind of experience for a business, we need to very much remember that conversation, again, is about action. We don't just talk about stuff, and conversation doesn't just passively happen to people. We actively construct it in partnership with each other. And if one of the interactants in that partnership is a bot, then we, as the ones who are building the product, have to consider, how are we going to co-create action with the user? Provide some kind of way for the user to move forward, optimize for action by starting, if you're going to use a menu, for example, in a chat experience, start the buttons with a verb. That makes it very clear to the user what action can be taken there. And then lastly, have a reason for all things language. Again, as I said, every punctuation mark, word, phrase, emoji, character, all of that signals meaning. It gives the users context about how to interpret the interaction at hand and negotiate the relationship with essentially your institution. So if you've got an emoji in your message, you essentially need to be able to explain why it's there. Why are we using 2 exclamation points? Why are we spelling okay with an AY? Why are we using emojis here and here as opposed to in front of the words or at all? All of these things need to be reasoned out so that way we can essentially provide that kind of rigor for our experience and stay consistent. I have a quick tear sheet for all of these 5 must-knows here. Happy to share this out as folks sort of see fit and need if anyone has any questions about it. And if you have any feedback for me or questions about any of this, I'm always happy to chat. My email is here.